Ms. Graham.
Can I take us out of the topic we're talking about for a moment and ask you to look at a document for me, please? It's PIRC 04153. And if we can look at the very top of that, that may be the top actually, it says it's a policy log. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you recognise it?
Yes.
My understanding is that this was commenced by Senior Investigator John McSporran.
That's correct.
And if we look onto the next page, you'll see it's a typed up table, if you like. And the first entry is John McSporran, 5th of May 2015. So this is the next day.
Yes.
And then on the last page, you'll see that the last date of it is in November, I think. We go right down to the bottom. 2nd of November 2015, and it says next to that entry, conclusion of policy file.
Yes.
Can we go back to the top, please? We've not heard from Mr. McSporran yet, but my understanding is he commenced that log on the 5th,
yes.
the day after you became lead investigator. And if we can stay with the first page, please, do we see that? Yes. It says, Senior Investigating Officer DSI William Little, Deputy Investigating Officer SI John McSporran. I think I had understood from your evidence that McSporran was the lead investigator and you were his deputy.
Yeah, I think I made mention that when I was first asked to become involved, I was advised that I would be the lead investigator and John McSporran would be providing oversight.
Right.
And I think that's the rationale. While John, when he commenced the policy log, he has put me down as the SIO. Yeah.
Right.
But I think I've also said in evidence it became very apparent that the scale, the investigation was becoming, and John assumed the role of SIO and I was a deputy SIO. Did that happen on a set day? It just very quickly morphed into that. Is the best way I could explain that.
So on the 5th of May, the initial plan was that John McSporran would have oversight of the investigation.
Certainly on the 4th, and I don't know what how John was briefed, but very, very, yeah. And John's obviously recorded it. John must have been briefed that I was to be the lead, and he was, as I said, the words used to me was provide oversight. But it very quickly became that John became the SIO and I was the deputy SIO. And John was my manager, or one of my managers at that time. Yeah.
I was going to say he was a senior investigator
Yes.
at the time, and you were a deputy
That's
senior
correct.
investigator at that time. To go back to the issue of the knife, which
Yes.
was found at Hayfield Road,
Yep.
and the significance of that. There's one column, if we go to number 10, 12, sorry. Oh, I might have the wrong. Yes, that's right. It's just above the number 13, however, if we can move down onto the next page. This is the only reference to knife in this document, and it relates to quite an early stage. Several members of the public observed the deceased walking along the road carrying a knife and telephoned the police. Police officers were sent. At some point, the deceased may have struck a vehicle or vehicles with the knife. So that's been a summary or a recording of the early stages of events on the 3rd of May 2015. Yes. What's the purpose of this policy log?
It's a SIO decision log. It's areas where you would put areas of strategies. You see their house-to-house strategy. What is the decision and the rationale for that decision. It's an area to record your bigger, more pertinent decisions and the rationale behind it. so that you can go back and understand why you made such a decision and when you made such a decision. So it's like a reference point, sort of, you know.
Right. And can you explain, this one's obviously typed. Are they normally typed and added to on a sort of rolling basis?
No, it's a hard, that's been typed up. It's a hard copy that
The
you write
hard
in.
copy. We've seen other policy logs
Yeah.
where they're all handwritten. This is a typed version of a handwritten document.
That's correct, yeah. It normally is as a kind of blue book and it's carbonated and you would write it.
And was this prepared and added to by John McSporran alone, or did you contribute in any way?
John made the entries, and when John and I kind of, you know, when John came on board and we sat down and we kind of divided up the task, what was going to happen, it was agreed that John would take a kind of, what describes as a strategic overview of it as the SIO, and he would maintain the policy log. He undertook some media that we dealt with, and strategic decision, and I would more be tactical and deal with the kind of the day-to-day aspects of implementing such the strategy and the decisions. But John, I don't think there's an entry. I don't think there's an entry in my name, and I don't think
I couldn't find one.
No, I've not made an entry into that log. It's maybe been I've discussed with John, and then John's completed the log up. You try to complete the log as timelessly as I can, but sometimes, obviously, some of the entries are fairly lengthy, so it takes you a bit of time doing them.
I'm interested in obviously we've looked at the briefing note
Yes.
from the 3rd of May, which you had a sight off on the 4th of May.
Yes.
And we looked at that earlier, I don't need to look at it again, but the reference in there was that the officers could clearly see that Mr. Bai was in possession of a knife and was making his way towards them. And the officers, at least one, drew their pava spray and issued a warning, but he continued to come forward.
Yes.
And you've mentioned before lunch the reference to the knife. I'm interested why this document, the policy log, would not have any reference to your realisation that he was not in possession of a knife.
That's, first of all, it's maybe a question for John to answer that, but from my position sitting as that's not a decision. That's evidence. You've found that. It's documented. It's through the production book, production log, that the knife's recovered, where it's recovered, and when it's recovered, and who it's recovered by. So it just forms part of the evidence change. There's no decision about, you know, we need to seize the knife, we need to identify a knife. That's just part of the evidence change. So if I was maintaining the policy log, I wouldn't have a reference in there in respect of knife recovered wherever it was recovered, because we know that, and that's recorded somewhere else, and we know who did it. And there's an explanation what they did with the knife.
Right. And I think that might also explain a later reference, which I think is at number 44. See that all the items are numbered. And this is a record dated the 3rd of June 2015, so the day before the officers give their statements, and it says SPA Forensics to undertake DNA profiling of items seized to show interaction between deceased and officers. And the next column says to provide proof of contact between officers and deceased. Now, would that have included, so that decision to send items seized to forensics, would that relate to the knife? Because we have heard other evidence much earlier in the inquiry that there was DNA profiling and fingerprints testing carried out on the knife. Would that have included the knife, or would that have related to something else, such as clothing of the officer Nicole Short?
My initial understanding of reading that is that would include the knife, because I know the knife was sent for DNA profiling, and I remember that what came back about the knife was in layman's terms, it's always described to me as it's a soup of DNA on the knife, and they couldn't separate that DNA.
So there wasn't any confirmation from the DNA analysis that Mr. Bio had touched that knife?
I can't remember if they were able to identify who that soup of DNA was. I don't think so. I think it was that was not ascertained.
Right. And I understand the forensic services report conclusion on 3 knives that were found in Arran Crescent and the knife found on the grass verge at Hayfield Road.
Yes.
And the conclusion is they were found to be similar in general appearance, i.e. similar markings to each other, and an opinion was expressed, in our opinion, knife 1, which could have come from the same set of the knives 1, 2 and 3 that were in Arran Crescent and compared, or any other set of knives with similar appearance and markings.
Yes.
And my understanding is that there was no DNA link established between Mr. Bio's DNA and the knife.
That's correct.
And there was no fingerprint link established.
No.
Now, my understanding is that at no point did anyone go back to Colette Bell and ask her to identify the knife found on the grass verge either. Do you know anything about that?
I've no comment. I don't know. I don't recollect that. If you're telling me that's what happened, I don't recollect that.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What I will say about the knife, if I can say, is if my memory serves me right, and it's maybe in the report I remember, is the knife, what it was sealed in, all that was it mentioned contamination with the chemicals they'd used to examine. If nobody went back to Colette Bell, then yeah, I understand that.
Yes.
But my recollection is the knife was, it was, I think it had a hazard marking on it, if my recollection serves me right.
There is evidence available to the chair that no one went back to Colette Bell to ask her to identify the knife.
Could you help me with one thing? This may be a question more appropriately directed to Mr. McSporran, but could you look at entry number 1, please,
Yes,
on the
sure.
log? The second paragraph says, on being detained, arrested, Sheku Bayo struggled with police officers who physically restrained him. Officers used CS Parva spray during the arrested and used police batons against the deceased. Sheku Bayo was taken to the ground by police officers where he was handcuffed to the rear and had leg restraints applied. Now, Mr. McSporran's made that entry on the 5th.
Yes.
And that is really quite a change, isn't it, from the briefing document that you saw on the 4th in terms of Mr. Bio's actions.
Well, it makes no reference to the information provided in the briefing paper of Mr. Bio in possession of a knife.
Yes.
Clearly in possession of a knife, if I recall correctly, and I think also running at the officers, and that's not in there.
That's not there. And do you understand why that is? How that came about?
No, I also see it. No, I don't, Your Honour, and I also see it talks about him being handcuffed to the rear. My memory is he was handcuffed to the front.
Well, perhaps I'll return to this with Mr. McSporran.
Yeah. Can I just also say in respect of a policy log, the first entry in a policy log when you're doing an SIO policy log is you provide a narrative of the circumstances as you understand it.
And this was prepared by Mr. McSporran?
It was, yes.
Well, we hope to hear further evidence from him. Can I ask you to go back to your inquiry statement, 255, the first one, please, I think, and at number 30, paragraph 38. Yes, it's sort of halfway, it's in the middle of the page as we see it on the screen at the moment. Now, the post-mortem is a Crown Office process. The Crown Office direct it. We looked at this paragraph before lunch, so we've looked at the first part. But you say, but we have a big part to play in it. So you're explaining here that the post-mortem is a Crown Office process, they
Yes.
direct it, but you say we have a big part to play in it.
Yes.
And I'm interested in that sentence. And you see, I was like, all right, as soon as you get told you're doing that, your head's starting to see, what do we need to do? What do we need to put in place? What do we need? And you realise the magnitude of the situation. So this is the paragraph we looked at before lunch that related to you on the 4th of May at the beginning. This phrase, we have a big part in it. What do you mean by that? A big part to play in it?
As I've said earlier, is that the post-mortem is a Crown process, yes. They are responsible for the time and the date and the pathologist, the number of pathologists at that point of view. But the aspect with the family is as the investigating organisation for this incident, for that aspect of the incident that we had at that time, is then we had a responsibility in respect of notifying the family, as I've said previously as well, as or it's in, I can't remember in evidence, but this is the only post-mortem that I've been involved in all my years where the family haven't come and identified the body. So the normal process would be I would have my flows, meet with the family, explain what's happening, let them know the timescales, and let them know what's going to happen and make arrangements. And this was taking place in Edinburgh, the City Mortuary in Edinburgh. They're in Kirkcaldy. Normally we would transport them as well. I think I said earlier, as a post-mortem is a very invasive, can be quite a harrowing process, just even being made aware or seeing your loved one and identifying your loved one. So invariably we would ask that we would drive them in case they were unable to drive back. So we've got that aspect of it. Is during the course of the post-mortem, there will be a number of samples taken by the pathologist, and I would need to supply a production team in respect of the samples that are taken by the Crown pathologist, and ensure that they're kind of secured, they're packaged, they're recorded accurately, and some of the samples we will take away, and we will need to make arrangements for where they need to go to for examination. Some of the samples the pathologists will retain, and they'll make arrangements for that. So there's a lot of work for us, as I would describe it, and that's a big part we've got to play. We don't just, as a post-mortem, we sit back in isolation and wait for an update. We're there, we're involved in it.
I'm interested.
Sorry, when I say we, I'm talking about organisationally.
Yes. I'm interested in what you say about your role in relation to the family. There's evidence available to the chair from an investigator that, in his view, it was not for him to interfere in that process. He was unaware of how the availability of the appropriate people in terms of the post-mortem, including the pathologist, what was available, whether that day or further ahead in the timescales. That wasn't for him. He was aware of all the circumstances that were relevant in relation to the scheduling, but ultimately the decision was for the Crown in terms of the decision to carry out the post-mortem.
Okay.
That sounds a little bit more hands-off than you've been describing. Okay. Would you agree with that description?
I don't know who the witness is, but the two investigators that I sent to the post-mortem was John Ferguson, who unfortunately is no longer with us and passed away during COVID. John was a hugely experienced investigator, and alongside him was Stuart Taylor, who was a trainee and had not been long as a trainee and came to the organisation from the Care Commission. This was the first this was the first post-mortem that he'd been involved in. So if that is where the information is coming from, I understand what he's saying there. Whereas if John Ferguson was here with us, he would be able to explain exactly, because John and Stuart were in the post-mortem. They're actually in with the pathologist when the post-mortem's taking place.
I don't want to leave you in the dark on this. That was me quoting from Keith Harrower's evidence.
Oh, my apologies. Yeah.
No, I hadn't said. Do you feel that's perhaps not as proactive as you was being proactively engaged with the arrangements for the post-mortem? Was that exclusively in relation to you, or would you have thought most investigators would take your approach?
I would say investigators who have comparable experiences I maybe have, or you know, in the kind of in that area. Now, I don't know Keith's experience there, but in my experience, this is what happens at a post-mortem. You know, so we're hands off in the arrangements of it and the kind of, you know, everything that happens round about it. But when the post-mortem takes place, you know, particularly in these circumstances, we have a very, very active role to take part in.
And an active role in relation to the family?
Yes, yes, yes.
And the arrangements for their attendance
Absolutely.
at the post-mortem?
Yes.
Can I ask you to look at paragraph 40, please? I think we're moving down. Either that's fine, thank you. Oh, sorry, that's 39. Can we move on? That's it. And you were asked in this statement about part of your PIRC statement. It states, I was further advised that during the events on the 3rd of May 2015. So do you see that on the screen? And I'm interested in the section where you say, it's just below halfway down, I did have a discussion with the Crown, David Green, about it in this instance. Keith had had some interaction with the family the night before, although I was appointing 2 family liaison officers to deal with the family. I think we've spoken about that. Sorry, I think I've mixed up my pages. Sorry, I've already dealt with this. Can I move on and ask you about Colette Bell, please? We've heard evidence from Colette Bell. She was the partner of Sheku Bayo.
Yes.
And she had recently had a baby.
Yes.
And we've heard evidence from Colette Bell that she wanted to see Mr. Bayo on the 3rd of May. She'd given a statement to officers in Kirkcaldy Police Office on the understanding that she would hopefully then be able to see his body. And she also gave evidence about having the long-term impact of not seeing him and the impact that had on her. From your knowledge on the 4th of May, you've told us about knowing the family wanted to wait for the mother,
yes.
and you'd asked Mr. Harrow to contact Addie Johnson. What were you aware of on the 4th of May in connection with Colette Bell and her status as Mr. Bayo's partner?
I was aware that she was his partner. I was aware that they'd had a child together. But at that moment in time, in dealing with this aspect, as the information that had been relayed to me is that the family single point of contact, if I could use that phrase, was Mr. Johnson. How that had been arrived at, I was unaware, and that was why I asked Keith to contact Mr. Johnson, because he had previous contact. Okay. So yes, moving forward, and on reflection, then there should have been contact with Colette Bell in respect of the post-mortem process and the identification of Mr. Bayo's remains. But at that time, in that moment when I was dealing with this, and in efforts to have the post-mortem process completed in a manner that I thought was suitable, i.e. the family or a family representative, as I'd asked Keith to do that, and as I say, Mr. Johnson was identified as the family single point of contact at that time, and that later moved. But following the passage of time, yes, that in hindsight, Colette Bell should have been contacted by the family liaison officers, and we may have been able to undertake the process that I view should have been normally undertaken, and that would greatly have assisted in our engagement with the whole family, in my view.
If you'd known on the 4th of May in the morning when you take on the role of
Yep.
lead investigator that Colette Bell wanted to see Mr. Bio's body, is that something you personally would have supported on that day and attempted to facilitate?
I would have supported it, yes, but I need to have contacted Crown to ask their permission.
Is that something you would have been willing to do?
Oh, absolutely, and it's something I've done previously in a PIRC investigation. I can remember a mother wanted to see her son who was the night before his postmortem, and I had to arrange through Crown for that to happen, and ultimately we made arrangements for the mother to go. We took the mother to, well, my flows took the mother to the mortuary, and there was a viewing, and that was a viewing rather than the identification process, because the pathologist wasn't there. That was a viewing, and that was arranged. So it's not something that would happen with a great deal of frequency, but we have had such a request and we have managed that request.
And is that the position even where you've told us about the time constraints, your arrival, your appointment as a lead,
Yep.
the briefing taking place that morning, and then we've heard the post-mortem took place at the lunchtime. Is that something you could have accommodated within that timescale?
Well, the thing is, because I was unaware of what Colette's wishes were, I was unable to even attempt that process.
Yeah.
I was unable to even, liaise with Crown in respect of that process.
Now, I think in your statement you say that you were driven to the post-mortem that day by Richard Casey.
I was, yes.
And was that... and you left Hamilton and the post-mortem was to be in Edinburgh.
I was, yes.
And I think there's an entry or two entries in your notebook which I said we would come back to.
Okay.
And if you want to have a look at those, that's PIRC 04200.
Thank you.
If we can move on to the page 3. That's page 2, I think. Oh no, it isn't. You're absolutely right. Sorry. I see that on the left-hand column there. 12:35. Can you read out that entry, please?
Whilst en route to PM, T/call from ACC Nicholson, expressing concerns with Police Scotland still being seen to investigate. And I've got asked him to contact DOI/HOI. So that would be Director of Investigations / Head of Investigations. Yep.
Right.
Yes.
Can I ask you about this call with the ACC Nicholson? You've said in your inquiry statements that you knew Pat Campbell and you knew ACC Nicholson.
That's correct, yes.
And I think let's look at SBPI 00421 at paragraph 2. And you detail who the officers were that you had prior knowledge of.
Yes.
Before you started in the role. And you mentioned Nicholson. And I think in summary, you say you'd worked with him on a number of investigations that included investigations. You had no relationship with him, but he was your former manager, and you'd engaged with him on occasions through different roles in Strathclyde Police.
That's correct, yes.
Now, we've heard that he was Gold Commander in the
Yes.
investigation, and I think in your second inquiry statement, which is this one at paragraph 2, you do comment further down, perhaps. You say you had no relationship, you'd
Yes.
had contact until you retired, but you say, I did approach him by email to see if he would consent to be a referee when I applied for the role of Deputy Senior Investigator with PIRC.
That's correct.
So was he actually your referee when you joined PIRC?
He was one of my referees, yes. Yeah, I can explain why that aspect happened.
Yes.
As my
please.
recollection is, in respect of the application form, as PIRC asked that the referees are able to provide some, I can't remember the phrasing, but provide some input in respect of your, I think it was in relation to attendance at work, and I can't remember what else, right? And the challenge I had, because my other referee was the Deputy Chief Officer for the States of Jersey Police, where I've been working, is the challenge I had is that my last two line managers had retired from the police. Okay, and the way I read that is it was looking for somebody who would still be able to speak to or provide information regarding my employment record and such like, and being aware that Mr Nicholson was still within Police Scotland. As when I had retired, he was the head of the CID. I emailed him at his Strathclyde Police account and asked him if he would be my referee.
Now, there are obviously lots of different types of references.
Yes.
You can have forms that have to be completed, or there
Yep.
can be personal written commendations for
Yep.
someone. There's references that are really just an acknowledgement that you worked there for a certain
Yes.
period of time. Can you describe the type of reference that you were asking Nicholson to provide?
I think it was just as in the first aspect you gave there. It was just the fact that I'd been employed when I'd been employed, and some aspect round about my attendance record from that point of view. So that was the rationale behind that. I don't know what sort of reference was provided, if any, by Mr Nicholson. I don't know. That would be something that our HR department could provide, but I don't know.
That's not necessary. Did you feel from your prior contact with ACC Nicholson that you had to declare that to your line manager in relation to your appointment on the 4th of May as lead investigator into the death of Mr Bio?
No, not on that occasion, but there'd been a previous investigation within PIRC that Mr Nicholson featured heavily in, for an expression, and I kind of advised that that was a conflict of interest for me, and I took no part in that investigation. Now Mr Mitchell was aware of that, because my understanding is he also, for that prior investigation, had to declare a conflict of interest, so he was aware of that. So in respect to that, and yeah, so I didn't outwardly say I can't be involved in this because Mr Nicholson's a Gore companion. No, I took it as read that Mr Mitchell would be aware of that because of the prior incident.
So you didn't declare that on this occasion.
No.
Was that because ACC Nicholson was Gold Commander but not one of the officers who'd been involved in the events at Heathfield Road?
No, I don't think it was because of that. I think it was because I'd declared previously at this previous incident or investigation that was undertaken by PIRC, and I declared then at a conflict of interest, and I took no part in that investigation. So Mr Mitchell, as the head of the department, knew that because he'd also, as my understanding, declared that conflict of interest.
Did you expect Mr Mitchell to remember that conflict of interest that you had had with Nicholson?
I did. I absolutely did, yes.
As I said earlier, I may be wrong, we haven't heard from Mr Mitchell, but my understanding is he didn't come back to work till the 5th.
Okay.
So I'm interested in, if that's correct, do you think now in hindsight, on the 4th, when you were appointed lead investigator, you should have notified senior management of that prior conflict?
Well, that senior management, if I am incorrect and John Mitchell wasn't there in the 5th, the senior management would have been Irene Scullion, and Irene Scullion knew that conflict of interest because she undertook the investigation that Mr Nicholson featured into. Right. So she was aware of that.
On the previous conflict of interest, you'd withdrawn.
I hadn't even withdrawn. I hadn't been involved in any way.
You weren't involved at all?
No, not in any way.
And obviously you felt that was the right course of action
Yes.
there. Why did you not feel that was the right course of action here? What was the distinction?
Because Irene Scullion knew that, and she was still appointing me as if Irene was the only one in. She was aware of that.
Did you not feel that you had any personal responsibility to draw that to her attention on the 4th?
Not at that time, no.
Can I ask you about the content of the conversation you had with ACC Nicholson? You've noted in your book 1235 you have a conversation with him, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
That's what you just read out. What were his concerns at that time when he called you on the phone?
My recollection is his concerns regarding the public perception is here we have a death in custody of a male or a person that had occurred in the street following engagement with the police, and here we still had police being visible carrying out inquiries. They were, the had officers, my understanding, the officers out and conducting house-to-house investigations, CCTV scoping, areas like that. So he felt as if that presented an issue in respect of the public perception of how this was being investigated.
Were there still officers in uniform at Hayfield Road?
I think there was, yeah. I think we still retained the site at that time, and they were providing scene protection.
And if we look at 255, paragraph 59, this is your inquiry statement. This is where you talk about this call.
Yep.
And I think you say he was also concerned regarding the perception of the public. Do you see that? It's just below halfway down.
I've got that, yes.
And the police were still investigating the death because the police had a bit to play and the PIRC had a bit to play, as the police had been instructed to investigate the preceding events, and we had to investigate the event itself and the events thereafter. And is this that division of labour that you expressed concern about earlier today?
Yes.
Was he also concerned about that?
Yes.
At the time? And you then said, you agreed with him and said, yes, this does look messy. The public would be saying, what do you mean this is an independent investigation? Police officers are doing door-to-door because they're doing door-to-door in their bit, whereas I've got a door-to-door team now taking over from the police in areas that we have been asked to investigate. Did you consider this to be a bit messy?
I think I absolutely agreed with Mr Nicholson in respect of what the public perception would be of this. And it didn't convey that it was an independent investigation.
And what did you do about this? Obviously, ACC Nicholson spoke to you about it that day. You agreed with his concerns.
That's correct.
Were there any steps you took?
I asked him to contact Irene Scullion in respect of his concerns, because I was aware that Irene Scullion, because I'd left the office by that time, was away, but my understanding was that Irene Scullion was liaising with Crown in respect of matters, and I felt that Mr Nicholson's viewpoint needed to be articulated to Crown in respect of that, and because Crown had made this decision, was this the correct decision, what would happen? So I asked Mr Nicholson to contact Irene Scullion in respect to that.
So you were supportive of him pursuing his concerns in relation to this via Irene Scullion, who was in Hamilton?
Yes.
And did you hear any more about this on the 4th?
I don't recall hearing any more. I obviously would have had some conversation with Irene, but I don't recall hearing any more about it. I may well have done, but I don't recall.
We've heard evidence that on the 5th, the following day, the first written instructions came in. And then everything was brought under the PIRC umbrella.
Now, whether that was a result of the conversations that Irene was having with Crown, and I presume Mr Nicholson would have been having with Crown as well.
All right, thank you. And then can we look back to your official notebook,
Yes.
which is PIRC 04200, and back to the entries that you have on page 3.
Yes.
And the next entry is 1245, and it says Edinburgh City Mortuary.
Yes.
I wonder if you could read out this entry, please.
Okay, so it's 12:45. I've got Edinburgh, short as Eborough City Mortuary. PM, Kerry Ann Shearer, and the next line, Ralph Boulader, I think is how you pronounce it.
Buhadir, I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation.
Thank you.
We've heard that they were the
There were
pathologists.
two pathologists, although I've not identified that. And I've got Mr Bernie Ablett, PF. He was the Procurator Fiscal in attendance at the post-mortem. I've got no sudden death report. Call to Detector D/Suman Campbell. No hospital record / no GP. And then I've got 17, and even with the photocopy, it's either 17:30 or 17:50 concluded PM.
Can you tell what the timing of that? It's your handwriting, obviously. Is that 30 or 50? What's the next entry?
I've got 17:50, so I presume it's 17:30.
Right, so the second line is 1750,
Yeah,
and the top line is 1730.
yes. Apologies, I'm not the neatest writer.
No, not at all. And the 1730 is when the PM concluded.
17:30,
Yes.
yes.
Are you quite sure about those times?
I've recorded that. Could I refer to my daybook, please?
Yes, please do. You have it. This is PIRC 04520.
520, thank you very much. So, in...
Could you tell me which page you're looking at? If we say...
Oh, it's not numbered, sorry, so...
Right.
The copy I've not got, but if you go by the times for that day, if you go, it's the very top of the page, and it's, I think the way it's been copied, it's missing, but it's definitely 7.50.
Yes. So it's page 8, I think.
That the next one, I think, is it? Yeah.
And it would maybe appear that the number 1 of 17 has been removed in the photocopying process. So that's clearly a 50.
Yes.
And what's the entry next to 1750 in your daybook?
It's telephone call from AL, which will be Alistair Lewis, access to house to get clothes, etc. for baby. Agreed that 2 DOs be sent. I've got 2 DOs be sent from Edinburgh to access house for items that family need. Concerns for... I can't even read more right there. Concerns for...
Those
Concerns...
officers?
Concerns for some that officers for Kirkcaldy enter house.
Right. So the...
Oh, sorry, concerns from solicitor that officers from Kirkcaldy enter house.
Thank you.
My apologies.
This entry is about a telephone call with Mr. Lewis, who was the flow, and it's times 1750.
Yes.
Can I assume that the PM was concluded prior to you taking this call from Mr. Lewis?
My recollection is, yes, it was.
And do you remember how soon after it concluded that you received the call?
I can't recall.
So we have the entry in your daybook of 1750, which is the call with Mr. Lewis.
Yes.
We have an entry in your notebook which notes the conclusion of the post-mortem, and then After that, there's another entry and it mentions call from AL in your notebook as well.
So in my notebook,
Do
not
you
my
want to
daybook.
look at your notebook as
My
well?
notebook, sorry. Right.
PIRC 04200.
Yes.
This
Yep,
is your
got you.
official notebook. We'll look at page 3, and it's towards the top of that page on the right-hand side.
Yep.
And does this help you then, having looked at your daybook, to identify the timings that you've noted here in your notebook?
Yes.
So what's the one on the top? Concluded
Well,
postmortem?
I think it's 17:30.
Right. And then
But in
the
the same
next
vein,
one.
sorry, my apologies, Ms. Graham.
Sorry.
But it could be 17:50 because it could well be I've written conclusion of postmortem and then 17:50 call from Al Lewis.
So from your memory now, were those events simultaneous?
Well, they were very close to each other, so exactly the difference in timing. Sorry, unfortunately, because of my scribbles, I can't exactly say.
But roughly
Yes.
at 17:50, the PM concludes,
Yep.
and you get a call from Mr. Lewis.
Yes.
Thank you. And you've mentioned the call from Mr. Lewis.
Yep.
Then the next entry is 20:05, so 5 minutes past 8.
Yes.
And it says Kirkcaldy Police Office. And I think Mr. Casey drove you to Kirkcaldy Police Office after the post-mortem, is that right?
That's correct.
What were you doing between 10 to 6 and 8 o'clock?
Well, we concluded at the post-mortem. In that aspect, then we made ourselves. We travelled to Kirkcaldy, and my recollection is we stopped at a service station and grabbed a cup of coffee.
I mean, you've been on duty since 10 to 8 in the morning.
Yes.
And then you went straight to Kirkcaldy?
I think we stopped en route for.
Apart from the stop.
Yeah.
Right. Looking at towards the bottom of that page then, you've gone to Kirkcaldy. It says you've had a meeting with Pat Campbell,
Yes.
Detective Chief Inspector Hardy, and there's then other entries,
Yes.
which I think we'll come back to if you don't mind.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you some further questions in relation to this meeting that you had when you went back to Kirkcaldy.
Yes.
Now, as I understand your inquiry statement, when you go back to Kirkcaldy, you had a meeting and Pat Campbell was there, and Detective Chief Inspector Hardy,
That's correct.
and yourself.
Yep.
Was Casey with you as
He
well?
was, and my recollection is that Stuart Wilson, a detective inspector, was there as well.
Right. So Stuart Wilson, the Detective Inspector, not Stuart Taylor, who'd
No,
been
no,
at the
no.
post-mortem. And tell us about that discussion.
Well, that discussion was in respect of various aspects. As I said there, the investigation. We obviously had. We were doing some, they were doing some. So it was about kind of clarifying the lines of investigation, is my recollection, and just some of the points I've made there, the house to house. I've got Police Scotland would continue in lines with terms of reference, armed terrace. It remains with Police Scotland is what I've put there. CCTV, so we've also had a discussion around about the CCTV and the productions, and what I've noted there is that we've also had a discussion regarding the productions that Police Scotland had gathered, and there was quite a number, and that they were to remain secure with Police Scotland, and arrangements, I think it's arrangements made when we would take possession of these items.
So that afternoon you've gone to the post-mortem.
Yes.
You've arrived at the mortuary at 12:45.
Yes.
You've remained there during the afternoon
Correct.
as part of that process. That's concluded at 10 to 6. You've had a short break and then you've gone straight to Kirkcaldy Police Office at just after 8 and had a meeting.
Well, it was either concluded at half. My writing's not clear. Well, it was, you know, maybe those other events happen that will kind of provide clarity in that. But
your notes, I think, cover an entire day, but the entries are quite, could I say, limited in your notebook?
Yeah, I understand that.
Is that normal to have quite limited entries throughout a whole day?
Yeah, from a notebook.
Yes.
Yeah, because otherwise I'd just be spending all my time scribing. I'm obviously engaging with people, with speaking with people. There's things happening I'm being kept up to date with. And yes, well, Ricky Casey is driving. Right? Part of the rationale for that was there was no PIRC cars available. In fact, we'd hire extra cars. We didn't have them by that time for the investigation. And the car that I had at that time did not have hands-free mobile. So when I made the decision to go through to the post-mortem, and it's not something I normally do, but in this instance I did for rationale that I've explained in my statements.
We'll come on to that.
Yeah, I had no means of communication unless somebody phoned me. I stopped and then would phone. So Ricky said he would drive me, and it allowed me, and that's how I was able to have the telephone call with Mr. Nicholson. My feeling is I would have had a number of phone calls during that journey, but only the one with Mr. Nicholson was kind of out with, you know, how we get on with things, who's doing that, what was happening here. Whereas Mr. Nicholson's to me was very important, because it was obviously raising the issue of the public perception of what's happening here. And as I said to you, I could agree with you. So my official notebook is to make notes in respective areas of, I would say, importance, and areas of evidential value. So if I took a statement of somebody, I would take a note of that. If I took an item as evidence, I would put that into my notebook. But it doesn't cover my day's activity. This is part of the reason for the day book. But again, it doesn't cover your whole activity.
Can I ask you, where was your day book at the time you were travelling to Edinburgh and you were spending time at the post-mortem?
My day book was with me.
That was with you as well as your notebook?
Yeah.
Were you taking notes in your day book further notes during the day?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I was taking, yeah, there was more scribbly notes in respect to that.
Right.
And I think you could see that there was more entries, yeah.
So as you were going through the process and during the day, you were scribbling things in your day book?
Yes.
And then, as I understand it, a document was later prepared that's typed.
Yes.
And I wonder if we could look at that, PIRC 04148. Now, this is dated the 5th of May, which is the following day.
Yes.
And it says it's officer's note post-mortem
Yes.
on Mr. Bio. Who prepared this note?
My recollection is I prepared that note.
And what was that note prepared from on the 5th of May?
It was prepared from recollection of what had occurred during the course of the post-mortem, and some notes in my day book. Right. And I would have suggested in consultation with John Ferguson.
Right. Who had been at the post-mortem
Yes.
as well. And do we see on the first page of this note, it details Monday the 4th of May,
Yes.
post-mortem scheduled.
Yeah.
There's reference to David Green.
Yes.
And the Kaiser examination.
Yes.
And it says the family of the deceased, do you see that, had intimated to both Police Scotland and the PIRC that they did not want to be involved in the identification of the deceased.
Yes.
Following advice from Mr. Green, arrangements were made for the deceased to be identified as follows.
Yes.
And there's no mention there of them waiting for the mother to attend, but you've explained that already to us today. There was then formal identification of the body carried out. And if we move down the page, please, we can see who was in attendance.
Yes.
We mentioned the pathologist. There was a photographer there to take post-mortem photographs of any injuries or such
Yes.
like. And then a number of people are mentioned as being in
Yep.
attendance. John Ferguson, PIRC investigator, DC Peter Gillane, DC Peter Grady, Bernie Ablett you've mentioned, who's a fiscal, and Keith Hardy, a DCI from Police Scotland.
Yes.
Was there anyone else? Yes. Next page. Richard Casey, PIRC investigator, yourself as lead investigator, and Stuart Taylor, who was a trainee investigator. So there were a number of people there. It says there, prior to the commencement of the postmortem, the difficulty with regard to family engagement and identification was explained. Both the pathologists were happy to proceed with the agreed identification.
Yes.
And I think you said earlier, this is the first time you have ever experienced a postmortem where the family did not attend to ID.
That's right.
And did you feel that merited an explanation to the pathologist?
Well, yes, because the pathologist, my understanding is the pathologist wouldn't proceed with the postmortem until there was a formal identification of the deceased. So there was a discussion about how that was going to be achieved.
You said earlier you went to the postmortem, but that wasn't your normal practice.
That's correct.
Can you explain why you attended this postmortem?
Yes, I can. Prior to the postmortem, I'd had a discussion with John Ferguson regarding the recovery of Mr. Bayou's remains from Kirkcaldy Hospital to the postmortem, and John had enlightened me in relation to some aspects round about Mr. Bayou's body, and an area in particular that caused me concern was the fact he talked about there was blood, as well as being in the nose area, dry blood. There was blood within his ears. You could see that the blood was around his ears. Being unaware of what had taken place, but having information that during the course of the restraint of Mr. Bayou, force had obviously been used, batons had been used, and I was concerned that these batons had caused an injury to the head that maybe led to the demise of Mr. Bayou. So, going back to a comment that Mr. Green made about the postmortem going ahead, I needed to know as soon as possible if the head if there was a head injury, and if that head injury had contributed to the death of Mr. Bayou. I needed to know that. And you maybe go back to kind of hypothesis. Well, that concerned me, and that's why I went through to the postmortem, because truth be told, I've got John Ferguson there, who's been a lot more postmortems in his career than I have. I've got John Ferguson there. I've got Stuart Taylor there. The fiscal's there. It's there. I don't need to be there. I had 101 things to do within the office. But my viewpoint at that time is I needed to know that ASAP. And that's why I went. And
why did you need to know that ASAP? What difference would that have made if that had proved to be the case? That a baton had caused a head injury which had resulted in the demise of Mr. Bayou?
Well, it could, and it may have changed the status of the officers. At that point, the status of the officers was there were witnesses based on the information we had, limited. And I say it may have changed because, as I said earlier, police officers are quite unique in society, as they're allowed to use force, even lethal force, as long as it's justified, proportionate, necessary. You know, but if Mr. Bayou and if the pathologist was able to give some verbal opinion that I'm going to use that was the primary cause of his demise, then I needed to know that as soon as possible.
Well, if I could stop you there, I wonder if that might be an appropriate time.
Take a 15-minute break. Ms Graham.
Thank you. Could I ask you to look at a paragraph in your inquiry statement, 255, paragraph 54, please? So it's continuing in relation to what we were talking about just prior to the break. You'd been given a briefing by Keith Harrower, that suggested that Mr Byle had been battened. And then it says, investigator John Ferguson, who'd been involved in the recovery of the deceased body to the mortuary, had advised me that there appeared to be substantial blood in the deceased's ears. So reference to ears there. Now, you said earlier that Mr Ferguson had been in the Victoria Hospital
Yes.
with the body and had been instrumental in transporting it
That's correct.
to the mortuary and attended the postmortem.
Yes.
And he has advised you that there appeared to him, at least, to be substantial blood in the deceased's ears. Now, we've heard evidence from Kerry Ann Shearer, who was the senior pathologist who carried out the postmortem. And there was no reference in the postmortem report to what's described here as substantial blood in the deceased's ears.
Okay.
Do you remember precisely what Mr Ferguson told you about that and where you were at the time he told you?
I was in the office when he told me, and it was when we were discussing the postmortem and his role within the postmortem.
Was that before the postmortem?
Before the postmortem.
Right.
Before the postmortem, and when he told me about the blood round the kind of nose area and the mouth area, and he mentioned this about the ears, and then there was blood. Now, I'm saying substantial blood in the deceased ears. Although at this moment in time I can't say if that's the exact words John used, but why would I use that word? It's obviously in respect to that. But whatever happened is John absolutely highlighted to me that there appeared to be, there was blood round about the deceased ear, and I was worried that had caused some form of trauma to the head.
Did John Ferguson give you any more information about the blood or
No.
when he'd seen that?
No, well, John had been involved in, as I said, removing Mr. Byers' remains from the hospital to the mortuary, along with SPA staff. I mean, as I said to you, that's why I went to the postmortem. It's not something I would normally do. I would have a team go to the postmortem, so why would I go to the postmortem? That's my recollection of that. What about the photographs from the postmortem, from the photographs of the deceased? Is that he was photographed before he was moved, is my recollection?
We've never displayed those on in relation to it, but the inquiry
I'm not
does
saying
have them.
but that could clarify that point.
Do you remember when you attended the postmortem noticing anything about Mr Byles' ears?
The thing is, I wasn't in the postmortem, so I'm in the viewing room at the city mortuary. The only people in the postmortem is the pathologist, the photographer, and the production team, which was John Ferguson and a police officer. Okay, so I'm not. Although there is like a camera, there is a camera facility, but my recollection is that didn't work, because normally you could sit, and my recollection of Edinburgh is you could sit and the camera could be moved to show. There also is the facility to have dialogue with the pathologist. Normally it's the pathologist would have dialogue with you, but truth be told, I've never ever known a postmortem I've gone to where I've actually been in interaction with you as sitting in the viewing room. So I couldn't see from that point of view. And also, my recollection is Mr. Byer was still intubated, so he would, he would have tubing round about his face. My recollection, and I may be wrong here, but my recollection is that had not been removed until the post-mortem, which in my experience is a normal scenario. They don't remove the tubing from a deceased until the post-mortem.
Do you remember John Ferguson giving a briefing to the pathologist?
I'm aware John gave a briefing. I can't recall if I was actually present for the whole briefing, because it was John's role to give the briefing, and he had the most knowledge of PIRC staff. He had the most knowledge, because he'd been there on the 3rd and through all the process of the deceased remains being removed to the city mortuary.
Now, we have no record or documentary record of a briefing note having been prepared by
Yes.
Mr. Ferguson for the purposes of the post-mortem.
Yes.
Are you aware of any briefing note or notes that would have been prepared by him
No.
at that time?
No, that's unfortunately, John would need to answer that. Maybe he just gave it off the top of his head,
And from your recollection now, do you remember any part of the briefing that Mr. Ferguson gave to the pathologist?
What words were used, I couldn't, after this passage of time, say no.
In particular, do you remember him drawing the pathologist's attention to the blood that he said was in Mr. Bio's ears?
I don't remember him saying anything about that to the pathologist.
Did you draw that issue to the pathologist's attention, given your concerns about the blood in the ears and the implications of that?
Not that I recall. It's obviously not for me to be saying to the pathologist. I do recall that I did ask of the pathologist, because I was concerned, in our area I was concerned about was the use of CS and PABA combined, and what if there could be a chemical reaction. So we had a discussion with the pathologist in relation to what areas of swabbing were required. And although we were trying to do everything possible here, because if you don't do it at the time, you can't do it later, for want of a better expression. And I specifically asked for the mouth and nose area to be swabbed because of a potential of some form of chemical reaction, because both CS and PABA had been used together. I certainly remember having that discussion.
Given your concerns about a possible head injury and the implications of that, did you speak to the pathologist about a head injury?
Not before the post-mortem, no. That if there was a head injury, the pathologist would have identified the head injury, and that would have been notified at the conclusion of the post-mortem.
And I think you mentioned this earlier. The inquiry doesn't have a statement from Mr. Ferguson.
Yes.
I understand he's passed away.
Yes.
Is there any other documents that you think we could look for, or we could try and find, that may assist in getting to the bottom of this reference in your statement about what John Ferguson says he saw?
John maintained a kind of I'll call it a running diary, a running log, which you have. I think I mentioned somewhere within my rule 8 in respect of that, because you asked me to comment on something. John maintained a running log, but copied into that running log, John had copied emails from other people, because I was asked to comment on this, and in fact it was actually an email from Police Scotland to somebody else in Police Scotland, so there is within the paperwork a running log in respect of how John, what he did, because John then took on the role of engagement with the SBA in relation to any forensics examination that were being undertaken. So, is there anything in that log? I don't know.
All right.
And I
Thank
can't
you.
recall. I remember having a discussion with John about the log, because John's viewpoint was he absolutely needed that for any future inquiry, legal thing, and my viewpoint with John was that gets included in your statement, John. You record that in your statement, but it wasn't recorded in the statement. It was recorded. It was kept as a separate document that you have.
All right. Thank you.
I know you have it because I said I made reference to it.
Thank you. So you've told us about your your concerns. You say on the second line there, you were worried that a head trauma injury was what had caused Mr. Bio to die.
Yes.
And then you, as we look down this paragraph, you talk about being reassured by the presence of Keith Hardy. Do you see that just below the middle?
Yes, I do.
So you say you didn't normally go to the postmortem. Not something I would normally do, but I felt I needed to go there. I was reassured over that because, do you see that sentence?
Got that.
Because when I went there, DCI Keith Hardy was there. Keith was there for the same reason I was there, due to that point. So can you tell us a little bit more about this? What was reassuring about the presence of Keith Hardy?
Well, Keith, and he was in charge of the major investigation team that and I think in the first day was acting as deputy SIO to Mr. Campbell, as he was there as well. And what I meant was it wasn't some outer turn that I just felt I had to go and do. That there you had the head of the major investigation team, that he was there at post-mortem as well. I'm not, this may be badly worded that, but it's not to say I was reassured that he was there in case there was, you know, a blunt force trauma injury that caused issue. I don't recall having discussed that. I think it was more the fact as he wanted to there, so he was timelessly made aware of what the post-mortem had identified in respect to that.
Right. And then, so you're saying, I asked whether I discussed my concerns about the potential head injury with Keith. I can't recall if I did or I didn't. And then you go on to say, I've no recollection of discussing my concerns with Keith.
Yes.
I discussed it with John Mitchell in respect of going to it.
Yes.
And tell us about this conversation you had with John Mitchell.
As I've said, my recollection is that John Mitchell was there. I was very, very late at night when I got back from the post-mortem and then going to Kirkcaldy and then getting back. I think that I discussed it with John in respect of that, as I'm quite certain when I get back to the office that if Mr. Mitchell was on that date, he wasn't in the office. It may well be that was the next day I discussed that with him. You know, I couldn't put a time on that, to be honest with you.
Could we go up the page, please? You had the discussion with John Mitchell. It was because I needed to know right away if blunt force trauma has killed this man.
Yep.
We go back to the status of the officers as witnesses. If blunt force trauma had been the cause of death, then the investigation would absolutely be whether the actions of the police officers were justified, proportionate and necessary. And that's why he went to the post-mortem.
Yes.
And it says Keith was there for the same reason I was there. Can we go up the page, please? Keep going, please. And you say the impression I got was that Keith Hardy was concerned because he wouldn't normally go to a post-mortem either. What caused you to think that he was concerned?
The fact he was there.
And why was he there?
Well, this was a very unusual post-mortem in my experience, because you had police officers and PIRC representatives there. So I would say in the normal course of event with you know, in my experience with Keith and his role was he would go to a post-mortem because he would have a team based there. If you were taking a murder investigation, he would have a team there, right, and they would report back. Okay, and that was part of the reason, you know, as I said, my rationale for going there, because I wouldn't normally go, but I felt I had to find out ASAP if there was an identified cause of death at that time. Okay, and my real concerns was over this head injury, if there was a head injury. Okay, so I'm there. I don't know Keith Hardy. That was the first time I'd ever met him. I'd never met him before. I don't know anything about him. But I knew from I knew that it was the DCI in the kind of midst, and there he is at the post-mortem as well. So it's
Did you invite him to the
No, I did not. No, absolutely not. No, it's not my place to invite him.
If we look back at PIRC 04148,
Yeah.
this is the note regarding the post-mortem, dated the 5th of May, and we can see who was in attendance at the bottom of page 1. And we see that there were 3 police officers there, DC Gillane, DC Grady and Keith Hardy. And I'm interested in why there were police officers there, given the terms of reference that PIRC are to conduct an independent investigation into the death of Mr. Bio.
Yes.
The cause of death and the events in the hospital are your terms of reference.
Yes.
You're conducting an independent investigation from the police, but there seem to be 3 police officers present. Can you under productions, you have John Ferguson and then Gillane and Grady. Can you explain why it was appropriate for those police officers to be there?
Well, firstly, the reason why they were all there, I feel that a question needs to be posed to Crown, because
Right.
this is Crown. I didn't invite them. I was aware that there would be, that the identification was going to be undertaken by John Ferguson and another police officer. I think it was actually Peter Grady. If my memory serves me right, you might be able to kind of confirm or whatever so they were going to be there for the process of the identification of the deceased. Yep. I had also asked John Ferguson, as well as that, as I need you as a production to take the productions. Yep. Now, Peter goes in. My recollection is that he was Police Scotland's production officer for their investigation, or had been designated, right at the very start. I think, before there was a handover from PIRC. So
If he was
sorry,
sorry.
just when thinking about it, my recollection is that all 3 of them were not in the post-mortem room. The only 2 were in the post-mortem room. There was John Ferguson and another of the 2 in the post-mortem room. And I think I explained the role of, to take possession of the samples as provided. So I've highlighted them as all being in attendance, but I don't know if all 3 were involved in productions. I've maybe just typed it up in that manner from that. But as to why the police were there, I can't answer that. I've never had that before. I've never been involved in that. I'm not aware of any other PIRC investigation we've had that there has been police involved in the post-mortem. But as I explained earlier, that's a Crown process, and it's Crown. So I don't know.
You explained earlier that PIRC have a role to play
Yes.
in relation to the post-mortem.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, did you express surprise or challenge the presence of police officers at the post-mortem?
I don't remember. I certainly never challenged it. I never asked Mr. Ablett why the police were there. I think, in reflecting back, that because we had a bit of investigation, they had a bit of investigation, we had this untidy investigation process going on, that was there. But I think Mr. Ablett or Mr. Green would need to explain that.
Do you feel, looking back now, that because of this issue regarding your terms of reference,
Yes.
and what's been previously called a parallel investigation with the police,
Yes.
leading in the events leading up to it, did that make you feel a certain way about the possibility of challenging? Did you feel less comfortable or less sure-footed?
No, I certainly don't recall having that feeling. I'm not shy in coming forward to use an expression of myself. No, I don't recall that. On reflection, and sitting here now, at this period of time, is not only is that untidy, as it throws doubt on the independence aspect of the investigation into the death of Mr. Bow. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I ask you what your expectations were in relation to, you ultimately were given information after the post-mortem?
Yes.
And what were your expectations about how the police officers present would share that information, or would they share that information? Did you have any expectations about them keeping that to themselves?
I don't think at that time I had. I think because it was it was such an unusual circumstances on that, as I didn't at that time warn them in respect of the, you know, the interim's findings, right? I didn't warn them about that aspect, not to divulge that to MD. With that, you know, yes, I didn't. On reflection, should that have happened? The problem being is they were aware of it. You know, they were back at the police. They were back at Kirkcaldy or on away before I. You know, apart even Keith Hardy, I think, was away. By the time I got finished and moved away. You know, so I just take it back through as it throws doubt on the independence. And they were aware of the interim result, and it was just an interim result, you know, of the post-mortem. Yeah, and but also do remember, and I can't remember who was present, I do remember asking Miss Shearer in respect of any impact on blunt force trauma having on the post-mortem and our initial understanding of our findings.
And was that after she'd concluded the
Well, that was after we concluded, yeah.
And is that when you were told by Dr. Shearer that wasn't something she, as part of her findings?
Yeah, the initial find, but obviously we were waiting on further investigations being carried out.
We've heard from Dr. Shearer that it was pending various investigations,
yes,
including toxicology,
yes,
and things like that. I think you've touched on this earlier in your evidence today. At the time the post-mortem went ahead, there were no hospital records.
Yes.
I understand that they had to be searched for in the hospital.
Yes.
And you appointed 2 people, I think, on the 4th of May.
I appointed 2 people the 4th of May to go and get the records and get them to the post-mortem. Yeah. And the feedback I had from them was that they couldn't find the records.
That was the hospital records.
That's the hospital records, yes. And ultimately, I had a number of phone calls, or I remember even the next day saying, well, we can't find the records, and my instructions to them were, go and search the hospital. There has to be records, and it transpires as Mr. Biles' hospital record, as nobody had put his name on it, so it had been filed in an area where records were kept with no name on it. But that took a number of days for us to identify the records, because ideally, or not ideally, as I would say that on every occasion that I'm aware of is you want the hospital records there, and the ideal one would be ideally the GP records there if you can identify. Now, in some cases, in some deaths, you can't identify a GP till much later, and that was one of the challenges as well, with no family liaison officer having been appointed and met with the family, and so we had no record of who the local GP was.
So no hospital records for the post-mortem, no GP records for and a lack of contact between the Flo and the family to work out even who the GP was.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned earlier, no sudden death report at the outset.
Not at the post-mortem, and my recollection is I phoned Pat Campbell about that.
I think you read out an entry where you talked about.
You know, I phoned Pat Campbell about that, where is the sudden death report, because the pathologist needs that, you know, and that is Police Scotland's duty to prepare and I expected them to have that. Right.
But I understand from your statement that ultimately you did get a sudden death report.
Yes, we get one fax through, yeah. And
was that at some point when...
At some point, I can't remember if it was prior, during or after. I'm sorry, I can't recall.
I think in your second inquiry statement at paragraph 49, we don't really need to have it on screen, that you say Police Scotland did produce a sudden death report. There was a delay in it being available. it wasn't available at the start of the postmortem.
Yeah.
But in your first statement, you said that your recollection at that time was that maybe a fax was received
I think it came
at some
through
point.
fax. Yeah, I think that's actually how it arrived, yes.
If the postmortem had been delayed in accordance with the family's wishes, presumably these things could have been resolved.
Yes. Yes.
Can we go back? We touched on this earlier when I was asking you generally about your day and your notes.
Yep.
We looked at your notebook and we looked at the entry in relation to you going back to Kirkcaldy, and you had a meeting. Can we start with something else before we look at your notebook?
Yes.
Can I ask you to look at a Gold Group meeting minute at timed 12:30 on the 4th of May? And sorry, that's PS 03161. And this is just to give some context to the questions. We've heard this was a 4th Gold Group meeting. It was on the 4th of May at 12:30. Now, we've heard a number of witnesses give evidence about this meeting. It was at Kirkcaldy Police Office. There's no list at the beginning that says in attendance,
Yes.
but can I assume, as you were heading to the postmortem, you were not in attendance at this meeting?
No.
And we've heard from others that, well, we've heard from Keith Harrower, he was not in attendance at the meeting.
No.
And we've heard from others that no one from PIRC was in attendance at the
Okay.
meeting. Were you aware of this meeting taking place when you took over as lead investigator?
No, I was not. No.
The minutes from the previous meeting, the previous evening, which we've also looked at, and I don't need them on the screen. This was a meeting after, well, 8:15 in the evening before, indicate that the next Gold Group meeting was to be at 11 o'clock on the 4th of May. But these minutes appear to be 12:30 on the 4th of May.
Okay.
Had there been any intimation at all to you on the 4th of May that this meeting was to take place?
No, I had no knowledge of this take place.
Can you explain to us how, as lead investigator, you would normally be made aware of meetings with the Gold Group? How would that information normally be passed to you?
At that time, obviously, it would be twofold. As on the 3rd of May, we had staff at Kirkcaldy. I can't recall who was that. I presume there was somebody at the Gold Group meeting on the 3rd of May.
Yes, yes, we've heard that evidence.
So if it had been diaried for a second Gold Group meeting, I would have thought that would have been communicated, potentially on the kind of briefing note that Keith Harrower prepared. So you maybe be made aware of a diary entry, and you would do your best if you were unable to, if I was unable to attend, to ensure that we had a representative there. But I wasn't aware of that, and that was then. But now it's completely different. Now's we've moved on a great deal in respect of attendance at Gold Group meetings, and technology's allowed us to do that.
How's that done now?
You would dial in no matter where you were on a Teams meeting. Yeah.
I think we've heard evidence from Mr. Harrower to the effect that he wasn't aware this meeting was going on.
Okay.
Although the meeting time is given in the minutes,
Yes.
but we understand they might be prepared at a later stage,
Yeah.
typed up. Had you known about this meeting in Kirkcaldy on the 4th, would you have sent someone from PIRC to attend?
I would have done my best to send somebody, bearing in mind the limitations on our staff and the actions I'd given out to people to do, but I would have consulted with Irene Scullion in respect of somebody attending that meeting.
All right. I mean, you've talked about having around 20 people in
Yes.
your team at that stage. Would there have been somebody available to go to Kirkcaldy for this meeting?
Yeah, we may have actually had somebody in Kirkcaldy. Brian Dodd and his team might have been there at that time, and they might have been in the office.
So could you have arranged to have someone
Absolutely.
take this task on as well?
Absolutely, yes.
Can we have a look at page 2 of this minute? You'll see just above item 4, so it's part of item 3, the investigative process. There we are. There's in blue bold the word task, and the first task there says advice to be gained from PIRC regarding the disclosure of the PM results to the officers involved in the incident. Supervisor to be identified to carry this disclosure out. Now, that we've heard was a discussion that was ongoing at the Gold Group meeting.
Yes.
And when did you become aware that this was something that was being discussed?
When I read these Gold Group meetings, you know, many days later when we got them, I was unaware that there was any such discussion taking place. I think you obviously go on to my disclosure of the kind of postmortem and my viewpoint in making that decision.
I'll go through that with
you.
you.
But I was totally unaware in respect to that, and the item underneath, the media to be aware of the postmortem results. I'm unaware why that would even be considered by the police, because this is a PIRC investigation. And any media release has to be run through as a PIRC investigation directed by Crown. If we were making any media or wish to consider making any media disclosure, we would contact Crown and run it through Crown, and we would ask Police Scotland that they must run anything by us and Crown. So that, I find that quite surprising.
And when you say surprising, how appropriate do you consider that entry there, that task to be?
It depends on the context of doing it, but to make your media staff aware of the results of the postmortem, which it says there, because there could have been quite definitive results provided by Ms Shearer. I have never been made aware of anything like that in any investigation I've been involved in.
I mean, is that something you would have supported if you'd been at the meeting?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I would have reinforced exactly what I just said there, that if they're considered, first of all, my viewpoint is media should not be made aware of that. That's I'm going to use the words confidential information, but obviously I went on to disclose that, so I understand, and I have a rationale why I did that. But that's confidential information. Why would you release that to your media staff who are dealing with the media? I can't fathom that out. No, sorry, Ms Graham, I can't fathom that one out. But I was really surprised when I saw the previous entry in respect of that they were discussing the disclosure of the postmortem results to the officers, even while the postmortem, before even postmortem. Sorry, what time is that? 12:30.
This is 12. This
so
is
the postmortem hadn't
12:30.
started yet. So they're discussing that before we. I find that quite surprising.
And when did you become aware that this topic of conversation was being discussed? Not necessarily from the minutes, but in your involvement on the 4th of May, when did you become
I wasn't aware at all that had been discussed on the 4th of May. I had no knowledge of any discussion round about that.
Right. Did you become aware later on the 4th of May?
No.
Right. Can I ask you about that meeting you had after the postmortem?
With Mr Campbell?
When you returned to Kirkcaldy
Yes.
Police Office, and I think you said earlier, Mr Pat Campbell, the SIO, was there.
Yes.
Keith Hardy was there. He'd been at the postmortem. Yourself, was Casey there?
He was.
And I can't remember if you said someone else.
I think Stuart Wilson was there. My
Stuart
recollection
Wilson.
is Stuart Wilson was there.
Right. And tell us about this meeting. Was this topic about disclosing the PM results to the officers raised at that meeting? So this is the meeting after the postmortem.
Yep.
In Kirkcaldy on the 4th of May.
Yeah. So I asked to speak with Pat Campbell at that evening in respect of we had these 2 investigations ongoing in respect to him. So I was wanting to get a wee bit clarity around about who was doing what, when they were doing it, the information that they had that related to our side of the investigation, how we got that information. who was his sort of principal people. By that I mean who was his office manager, who was his production person, who was his CCTV, all the coordination bits, and the scene manager coordination. I think I maybe knew it was Stuart Houston at that time, but I wanted to know who these people were so I could have my people liaise with them. There was a bit of me was hopeful that when I arrived there that the reluctance of the principal officers to give statements had been resolved, because I'd never came across that and have never ever came across that in any investigation I've been involved in. And they confirmed that they hadn't provided statements. So I had, reflecting back, I'd been weighing up in my head about how do we resolve this. Not having these statements, which I've alluded to previously, was significantly hampering the investigation, you know. And I was like, how do we resolve this? Because we need to resolve this. This, my viewpoint, it can't go on. It just can't go on. And given the interim result of the post-mortem as ascertained pending further examinations, included toxicology, and that my specific question I'd asked of Ms Shearer if blunt force trauma, is I made the decision to, bear in mind Pat Campbell knew that, well, Keith Hardy knew it. I presume he told Pat Campbell before I got there. I'm unsure if he knew about the blunt force trauma, but I made the decision in hearing that to disclose that information to them, and I have to say it's something I've never done previously. I hadn't done prior to that in anything I've been involved in, and I haven't done it since. So it wasn't a kind of a decision I made lightly. But I thought and I hoped that would actually break this deadlock of the officers not providing statements, and that was my rationale for doing it. And I was aware from my earlier conversation with Alistair Lewis that I'd advised Alistair, and Alistair had told me that he'd been in contact with the family solicitor, and the family solicitor confirmed that he was a single point of contact, and I had updated that information to Alistair to be passed on to the family solicitor. So it wasn't like I was making this decision without the family and my understanding at that time being made aware of that decision.
When did you update Alistair Lewis?
I updated when I spoke to him.
Was that the entry we looked at earlier, 1750?
Yeah. Yes.
And was that when you asked that he pass on that information to the family solicitor? There was the topics we had was round about the kind of getting access to the house, which I was surprised that was getting referred to me, because that was their scene. That was Colette Bell's house.
Yes, that Police Scotland had made that decision to seize that house. Crown had confirmed that I was Police Scotland's part of the investigation, but they were asking me whether Miss Bell could get access to the house, and to me that was just absolutely. If I had been controlling that scene, absolutely Miss Bell's getting access to that house. Or if concerned about contamination, then somebody needs to go in that house, and you need to get what the baby needs. There's no two ways about that. You need to get what the baby needs. You know, so I was surprised with that. So that kind of, I would say that maybe dominated the kind of information. Then Alistair told me that he spoke to the solicitor appointed by the family, and I says, well, here's the result of the post-mortem, and it's unascertained, pending toxicology, and the fact that blunt force trauma had not played. I can't remember the words Kerry Ann said at this moment in time. I wish I'd written all that down, exactly what Kerry Ann said to me. You know, but yeah. So that was in the conversation with Alistair round about 1750-ish or before or whatever.
You mentioned hoping that intimating the interim result from the post-mortem to the officers would break the deadlock.
Absolutely.
Was there any basis for that hope?
Yeah, because what Mr Campbell alluded to me was that the area commander was in the office. He was going to phone all the principal officers and advise them of the information I'd provided, and he gave me the impression that we would have our statements within the next day or the day after. That's the impression I had. So I left there saying, okay, I did something unprecedented, something I never did before, but we're breaking the deadlock here because we have got no information about what these officers did, why they did it, what they encountered. We had no information. It was all just kind of milling about, as maybe what Keith's initial briefing paper kind of provided.
In terms of your reasoning and the way you were thinking,
Yeah.
did Pat Campbell tell you or reassure you that you'd get the statements if you did it before you made the final decision, or did he reassure you after you had made that final decision?
I wouldn't. I don't know if I used. I don't know if I used the word reassured. I'd certainly had got a positive impression from him that we would have the statements.
So was that before you made your final decision or after?
I think it was after I made my decision.
Right.
I think it was after. Yeah, because I realised that this was, as I said, unprecedented. But I was maybe not the right choice of words, but I was taking a chance here that we could break this deadlock. Yeah.
And this was something independent that you came up with
Yes.
as a possible solution to the
Yes.
difficulties?
Yes. As at that time being the lead investigator, I made that decision to reveal that information, totally unaware that this discussion had been taking place in Police Scotland. Totally unaware of that.
So you'd heard nothing of this discussion that was
No.
taking place on the Gold Group meeting?
No, none whatsoever.
And had anyone spoken to you about this as a possible solution?
No, nobody had. I'm actually, I'm a wee bit kind of dumbfounded that that actually was getting discussed with police, because I'm not aware in my experience of that ever occurring previously. It's not something I would have told if I was in a homicide investigation that I would have told a witness.
Can I just clarify?
Yes, sir.
Who, at that meeting with Campbell and the others, who first raised the issue of disclosing to the officers the results of the postmortem?
My recollection, Your Honour, is that I asked about the statements. Where are we in respect of the officers' statements? And basically, my recollection of the response is we don't have them. They've not been provided. And that's when I decided that I would reveal. I had been, my recollection again is, in the journey, I had been contemplating this as a means of breaking the deadlock, because at that time, my opinion was that this deadlock with the police officers was causing untold harm, not only to the investigation, but I envisaged that when sat down with the family and we had the statements, the untold damage it would do. I can understand the family, the upset and the concern, and also from a point of view as it was really, really hard to take this investigation forward. Yes, we're taking on, we're going to Letteringham, give us airwave, give us Storms, give us that. But with 9 police officers who'd been attending at that instant and we didn't know what happened. Unprecedented is how I describe it.
Can I ask you to look at your first inquiry statement? This is 255 at paragraph 63. And it begins at this stage. I didn't even know the sequence of who arrived first and such like.
Yes.
I'm interested in the latter half of this,
Yes.
where it talks about, I recall that they said to me, you'll have your statements by tomorrow, and that's in quotation marks.
Yes.
So I was fairly confident we were going to have these statements. The situation can't continue was the way I felt about it.
Yeah.
And when you say they said to me, a moment ago, I think you said it was Pat Campbell you were talking to.
Yeah.
Is they a reference to Pat Campbell or to all of the people who were at that meeting?
No, it's a reference to Pat. They didn't all say that. So that's maybe not clarity there. And I know I said that I was hopeful that we get the statements the next day or the day thereafter. But it was a fact that they were telling me that the area commander was in the office and he was going to be phoning all these officers. Right.
Do you remember the name of the area commander?
It's Gary McCune.
Gary McCune. And the comment there in quotation marks,
Yes.
is that what you recalled
That's
Campbell saying?
Yes. Yeah.
So when you left that meeting, having taken this unprecedented decision, when did you believe you'd be getting the statements?
Well, I believe they're getting the next day, or I'm sitting here on reflection a day thereafter. But the statements would be forthcoming sooner rather than later.
Of course, we know that wasn't the
No,
case.
absolutely, it's not.
You mentioned earlier that you'd set out your rationale in your statement.
Yeah.
Can we look at your second inquiry statement? This is
Yeah.
421 at paragraph 67. And if we look at your response there,
Yes.
you comment they still hadn't provided statements, unheard of, and then you talk about your rationale
Yes.
to try and break the deadlock and get those statements. And you were aware your actions were unprecedented, but you thought in the situation you were in at that moment it was appropriate. And you then, I think, set out a number of reasons, if I could summarise these as factors you took into account
Yes.
in making that decision. And the first is, I had earlier spoken to Alistair Lewis and provided with him with an update. And this information was passed to Amr Anwar, who was then representing the family
Yes.
at 17:40 hours that date. Now, we had looked at your notebook
Yeah,
and
yes.
your reference to a call with
Yes.
Alistair Lewis. And your understanding then was that Mr. Lewis would share that with Mr. Anwar.
Yes.
And you put in 1748 there.
Yes.
Where did that time
That's came from the flow log.
That was from Mr. Lewis.
That's came when I checked the flow log when I answered this, so that I was able to definitively say that that's the time that Alistair put in the log.
So I think in your notebook it was 1750.
I've got 1750 telephone call.
Is there anything in that differential between the times there?
No, I don't think so. I've marked up that time 1750. That's when I'm writing up that note. I'd spoke to Alistair Lewis prior to that note, and then I made the note afterwards when I had a minute to make the note. So.
Okay. And so you spoke to Alistair Lewis, gave him the update.
Yes.
As you understand it, he was to call Mr. Anwar.
Yes.
And then did he call you back to confirm that, or was that just a?
I can't recall. I can't recall. Just check. I've got my book still. I can't recall. Alistair also made me aware he was going to visit the meeting arranged with the family, which was going to be his first physical meeting with the family at, I think, about 18:30 that night or whatever like that. So I can't recall if I had a further conversation to confirm.
Right.
But I had Alistair saying that he was going to pass the information. He's recorded it within his flow log as passing the information, and I knew he was going to meet the family. Now, the family knew the postmortem was taking place because it had been the three different contacts with them between the twice and the third, and Keith Arthur phoning them at the fourth. So to me, there was no doubt that they knew the postmortem was taking place, and I cannot imagine that there was a conversation that Alistair had with the family and they weren't made aware of the interim result of the postmortem, just the basic unascertained.
We've heard evidence in relation to this,
Yes.
but really in terms of your own expectations, am I correct in understanding your expectation was that the family would be told about this
Yes.
by
absolutely.
Mr. Lewis?
My expectation of the family would be told by the family solicitor.
By the solicitor, and perhaps did you expect Lewis would speak to them when he visited
Yes,
them?
absolutely, because he was visiting them, and he did visit them.
Yeah. And that was we've heard that was a face-to-face
Yes.
visit. So you would have expected two sources of information.
Yes.
Two people providing information
Yes.
to the family. And then look at the next bullet point. It was, as you said, the interim result of unascertained pending further examination and not the full result,
Yes.
which would be confirmed in the future. And so that was a factor in your decision making,
Yes.
your thought process.
It's not laying out the cause of death. You know, so it's not the findings of the post-mortem, you know, so it's not laying out.
And then the pathologist had confirmed that blunt force trauma had not killed this male,
Yes.
which you've already spoke of. Police Scotland officers were in attendance at this PM, so this result was known to a number of officers.
Yes.
You've talked to us about
Yes.
that, and your thoughts about whether that information would be shared with other officers. Not having any statements or information from the attending officers was hindering investigation from the outset.
Yes.
That was the difficulties which you were experiencing as the lead investigator.
Absolutely.
And you wanted to get beyond that. And then this interim result reinforced in my mind that the attending officers were witnesses, and I wanted it confirmed to them and why. And why?
In order to get a statement.
It was in order to get, in
Yes.
the hope that this would also move
Yes, that
things
they would
on.
provide statements, yes.
Right. Did you consider, when you were thinking it through, that you would share this information and perhaps not get the desired result?
That was a chance I took, and ultimately that's what the result was. I made a decision. I made a decision in my mind. I rationaled it, but there was always the danger that we wouldn't get it. Bearing in my mind, the backdrop has always been as I have never known police officers not to give a statement in respect of an incident they attended. I've never known that. So I was hopeful by taking this step and I was hopeful that when that information was imparted to them, they realised the seriousness in my mind of not providing a statement.
And did you were aware at this stage that the officers had been advised to take legal advice,
Yes,
and that was part of their consideration
Yes.
in deciding not to give statements?
yes.
Did you at any stage consider speaking to their solicitor?
Not at that time, no. No.
In retrospect, do you think that might have been a sensible step, given that it was, in part at least, a desire to seek legal advice that was part of the hurdle towards securing a statement? Speaking to their lawyer and saying, if I give you this information, will you give
Yeah,
a statement? Might have helped.
Yeah. No, I didn't consider that. Look, even if I knew who the lawyer was, because I didn't know who the lawyer was at that time, I'm quite certain I didn't know who the lawyer was. I knew the Federation had given that advice and the officers had acted on the Federation advice. I didn't know who the lawyer was, as the Federation used a number of lawyers, but the base of it was, no, I didn't consider that.
Did you consider speaking to the Federation?
No.
I'm conscious of the time.
Yes.
I wonder if we should perhaps stop there.
We'll continue with your evidence on Tuesday.
Yes, Your Honour.
I'll come back to this.
Journal Tuesday.
I have time to do everything. I thought I'd maybe get to a reasonable place.